The Lukan wave is very exciting because the Lukan wave, you can think of the Lukan wave as that sequel to the wave of Marcion's Gospel. Okay. And again, Marcion's Gospel is proof that the the Lukan wave is a wave, right? Because we see two different versions. We have attested two different versions of something that I'm calling, well, I'm calling the original the prototype gospel. And as we learned last week, the way that I envision it is something called the Semler hypothesis, where the prototype gospel is informing both Marcion and canonical Luke. So I don't think the author of canonical Luke is directly using Marcion. And why don't I think that? Well, very simple, because he doesn't like Marcion. But interestingly, he would use the prototype. He would use the original gospel that he thought that Marcion corrupted, whereas he would not use Marcion himself. So there is that subtle difference. So if we were to look just at internal evidence in Luke, which is, I recommend doing that first, because really all that we have here, folks, is the literature, right? And then there's a huge amount of tradition that's built around it, but it's the book itself that has survived. Okay, so let's look at the book itself. And as I wrote in the challenge, this particular version, this particular wave, we can call it the canonical wave or whatever you want to call it. But this particular wave has a very sophisticated preface. The preface, it looks like someone, like a kind of a person like gesturing toward Herodotus or Thucydides. And the best way to compare it is actually really just by comparing Josephus. If you're familiar with Josephus, it's really, really helpful to compare how Josephus opens his histories. But what we can tell from the preface is that whoever is, I would say, not fully writing, but revising this text, is a fairly high status male author. We can tell he's male by the Greek, actually. And he claims, he doesn't claim to be an eyewitness, but he does mention the eyewitnesses. He doesn't say he learned directly from eyewitnesses, but he throws in the eyewitnesses. He's really a scholar. His only real claim to doing a better job is that he thinks he's done better research. He thinks he's done better research. He's aware of many polloi. He's aware of many who have tried to do this project before him. And, I always think it's interesting that he didn't really mention any of these people. Maybe that's obvious because he actually doesn't want to mention people like Marcion. And he may not know Mark as Mark, right? Because the titles might not have been known or widely known at his time, which I'm envisioning to be around the mid-2nd century, and I'll tell you why soon. So that's his only claim to fame, just research and the ability, the rhetorical ability to produce an ordered account. Okay, that's his only claim to fame. That's it, folks. And so he's not an apostle. Trust me, if he was, he would have named himself, right? And that, again, this is a great contrast with Josephus, because that's the very first thing that Josephus does. It's the very first thing that Herodotus does. It's the very first thing that Thucydides does. By not naming himself, he's really breaking the convention. He's really breaking the convention, and he has to know that. And I think that, regardless of what your theory is of why he doesn't name himself, I think it's fairly clear that he doesn't name himself because he has absolutely no special claim to authority as an author. Okay. All right. So as you're reading along, and you can, in the challenge, I gave you all those passages which are said to be explicitly not in Marcion's Gospel, which kind of gives you a flavor for this author's rhetorical and literary abilities, and they are good. This guy writes a wonderful story. I mean, let's face it, folks, we wouldn't really have Christmas without the Gospel of Luke, right? I mean, that is the most beautiful story, I think, and the best well-connected story in all of the New Testament. It is the infancy narratives. It's an amazingly well-written tale. This is an amazingly high-status author who is good at what he does. He's good at what he does, okay? he would make an excellent fiction writer and a ghost writer today. He is really good. I mean, in fact, he is a kind of ghost writer, right? I mean, because he doesn't name himself. But anyway, we get to this passage in Luke 13:35, which is one of those rare passages where the author sort of unintentionally indicates where he is in time, in the great arrow of time. Okay, he mentions that, probably taking from Matthew or the Matthean way, that your house forsakes you, speaking to the Jews, meaning that your temple is destroyed. That's at least how most people interpret it. So he knows that the temple is destroyed. Okay, he's absolutely sure of that, most likely because it's already happened. And later he describes this in really precise detail, and this is absolutely unique to canonical Luke. The other Gospels do not have this kind of precise detail. So he says that your enemies, this is in Luke 19, your enemies, speaking to the Jews, will set up ramparts around you, and Jerusalem specifically, and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone on another. Should remind you of the little apocalypse in Mark. And here's an interesting case where we can tell exactly where he's pulled something and he's moved it to another context. He's moved it out of the little apocalypse into this little vignette, which he creates all by himself, the lament over Jerusalem. And, you know, this kind of knowledge, I say it's detailed. I mean, it's not amazingly detailed, but it's clear that anyone reading Josephus would have this sort of more detailed information. It's comparatively more detailed than any other gospel writer. And it's a pretty decent generalizing summary of what did happen in the summer of 70, in the first revolt. Okay. They set up siege works or ramparts. They were surrounded. Jerusalem was surrounded, was cut off. It was widespread famine in the city. People were eventually crushed to the ground. Women and children, all dead. Stones thrown down. This guy has pretty detailed knowledge. Jerusalem has been destroyed. So I don't think really, I mean, there are people who will argue that Luke is written prior to 70, but I do not think that that in any way can be established. Okay, so if we look again at Luke's version of the little apocalypse, you know, the wave has finally come to its final ebb here. And there's a lot that's the same and a lot that's different, and I can't go line through line. But I think really the clincher for me is this Luke 21:20. And again, this is utterly unique material. No other gospel writer, Mark, Matthew, no one else actually mentions this specific point. It's Luke 21:20. So when you see Jerusalem surrounded by legions or army camps, the Greek word here is stratopodon. And I think this is utterly fascinating. Now, 95% of other scholars are going to take this as simply another reference to what happened in the summer of 70, because, you know, there were surrounding armies around Jerusalem. But I think that this is actually wrong. And admittedly, you know, the case is not clear cut. I'm never saying that there's a smoking gun here, folks. I'm presenting hypotheses and I'm arguing for them. And my hypothesis is that that theory, that this refers to 70, will not stand because of this word stratopodon. Stratopodon from stratopodos. A stratopodos is not an army in action. A stratopodos is a passive army encamped. It refers simply to a legionary encampment. It's in the plural, so it refers to several encampments. And I think that really the best historical reference is the actual encampment of the Legio, or Legio 10, the 10th legion for Tensis. And Josephus says that this legion was assigned to Jerusalem after the fall of Jerusalem. And there's lots of archaeological evidence for this legion being in Jerusalem or very near Jerusalem probably in the northwestern area, near an area called Moza. We have like roof tiles, we have stamped, conduits, we have piping that is stamped with the Legio Tenfretensis. They were in Jerusalem for a long, long time, from 70 well into the second, into the third century. They were permanently stationed there, permanently stationed. Okay, so they were not an active army. They were not an active army. They were a stratopodos. They were a stratopodos, meaning that they were a stationed army camp in the vicinity. Okay, so I think that Luke, or the author, or the editor, whatever we call him, of this particular wave knows about the Legio Tenfretensis, the 10th Legion. I think he knows it. And I think he's not really intending to tell you that he knows it, but he knows it, and he lets it slip through here. Okay, now we still haven't located him in time, because the 10th Legion is there for a long time. It's there, from 70 and beyond. But then the editor of this particular version gives this other hint, and I think this particular hint combined with the previous does clinch it, for me at least. And I'm happy to receive pushback, but this does clinch it for me, that he is talking about a time when, a very specific time in Jerusalem's history. Okay, because between 70 and 132-ish, okay, Jerusalem was not trampled by nations. Sometimes you'll see this as trampled by Gentiles. It could even be translated by pagans. That's perfectly fine. The word here is ethnon. So Luke, or the Lucan author, the author of this wave, is envisioning a time, or times, as he says, of the nations, and a time specifically when Jerusalem is trampled by these nations. And when the Romans did destroy Jerusalem, it was a barren wasteland between 70 and 130. Some people did remain, but it was largely uninhabited. And you had Jews who stuck around, but not in large numbers. But there was a continual appeal to refound the city, to remake the city, to rebuild the temple. And eventually Hadrian approved all of this, but he had one dirty trick. He made this, instead of a Jewish city, into a Roman colony. And this was the time when Jerusalem was, or did receive, a vast influx of other nations. Other people from other nations who were enticed by certain things that you would get in a Roman colony, such things like land grants and tax benefits and things of that nature. Okay, so this would be a wonderful way of describing the situation of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, as the time when the nations were in control, when the pagans were in control of the city. And this is a distinct time in the mind of this Lucan author, the time of the nations, or times of the nations, right? And he envisions it as a fairly long time. And I think that he's well aware that it's a specific time. He's looking forward to the end of those times, but they have not yet come. All right, so that's my argument based on the internal evidence. Now, external evidence, deliberately putting this second, because here we get to church tradition. And that's really all that we have. We don't have like hard data, like diary entries and archaeology and inscriptions. We just have church fathers talking. That's what external evidence is. And it's very unfortunate that in our modern, academic departments of religion, a lot of this church father tradition gets thrown around as if it were fact. It gets thrown around as if it were fact, as if it were actual hard data and evidence. But that is not the case. That is not the case, because what the church fathers say about the Lucan wave doesn't accord with what's actually inside of it, or at least I want to convince you. So really the first attestation of according to Luke is our friend Irenaeus, who's writing again between 180 and 189, and he mentions an entire kind of the incipient legend of Luke, what I'll call the legend of Luke. And the legend of Luke is built off of not anything inside of Luke, not anything inside the Lucan wave, but it's built off of Pauline letters, and specifically forged Pauline letters. So, I mean, they might not all be forged, but it's interesting that at least two of them were. For Philemon 24, we have Paul's only letter to an individual person, in which at the end of this letter, he greets some of his best buds, apparently, and we get three dudes, Mark, Demas, and Luke. And this little trio appears also in two other what are probably forged or pseudepigraphical letters of Paul, the other being Colossians 4:10 and 14, where we have greet Mark and Luke, and wow, Luke becomes a doctor. And there he is with Mark and Demas again. That's interesting that they're all paired together. I guess it's a threesome. And then we've got 2 Timothy 4:10 through 11. Demas abandoned me, bad Demas. Luke alone is with me, and then take Mark along with you. I can't fit the whole passage here, but it's the same three guys. So you can tell, whoever is crafting these Pauline letters is crafts them in the best way that a forger would. They don't just make things up out of whole cloth, right? They use phrases and personal names and little vignettes, personal details, which will be taken as authentic. And so it seems like Paul had these three friends, and they might not have been as close to him as Timothy and Titus, but they were a very close circle, and they were Mark, Demas, and Luke. Now, interestingly, I also saw on History Valley that Chrissy Hansen has argued that Philemon is a forgery. I have yet to examine his arguments in any kind of written form, but I just throw that out there. All of these could be forged letters. All of these could be forged letters. Now, in terms of the politics of New Testament studies today, I would say 99% of people take Philemon as authentic, and about 50% of people take Colossians as authentic. It really depends on if you're at a secular department of religion or a Bible college or seminary. If you're at a Bible college or seminary, your chances are you're going to take Colossians as authentic. But it's really hard even for a conservative evangelical to take 2 Timothy as authentic. Of course, some do, but the percentages get less and less because it's a harder case to make. But whatever you think of this, it is interesting that these names get recycled. They get recycled. And, there's little details added, like Luke's a doctor, and that Demas has abandoned Paul in prison, and Luke has remained faithful. And then we get to these famous we passages in Acts. Okay, I said we're not going to talk much about Acts because we don't have time, but Acts is very central for the conservative evangelical debate about placing Luke and about dating Luke, because if they can prove that it's the same author and they can prove that Acts is early, then they can prove that Luke is early. I think they've got it backwards. You don't start with Acts, which could largely be fiction. You start with Luke and you look at Luke apart from Acts. But there's different methods here, okay? One thing that we definitely have to look at is these we passages, right? The author of Acts does occasionally, on 4 occasions, use the first person plural pronoun. And he indicates that he is traveling with Paul, right? And a lot of people use this to say that he is a traveling companion with Paul, right? There's great reasons not to take this in such an, I would say in such a simplistic way, because it turns out that in other kinds of histories, that the use of the first person plural is actually quite common, and it is very common in terms of ship travel narratives, and it's only in ship travel narratives that the author of Acts uses this particular technique. I do not at all think that it's in any way clear that he is posing as an eyewitness or as a companion of Paul personally, and we can get into that later. But here you go. He is giving us an impression which might lead someone to think that he was Paul's companion. And it's from this impression that the early church fathers get their start, right? From these we passages, they conclude that Luke's companion wrote Acts, and from Paul's letters, they pick out Luke's companion. Now, why exactly they picked Luke is not clear, but that's what they did. They picked Luke the doctor. They couldn't pick Demas, and they couldn't pick Mark because Mark already had a gospel. But why did they pick Luke? Don't know exactly. The Muratorian fragment, which we looked at or talked about a bit last week, is probably a 4th century forgery, but it gives us the fuller legend that develops after Irenaeus. So it's important to know about, okay, whether you regard it as authentic or inauthentic. It's important to know the legend. So the 3rd book of the gospel, according to this fragment, is ascribed to Luke, and it's compiled in his own name on Paul's authority. It's actually not compiled in his own name, but never mind that. And it doesn't actually mention Paul in the actual Gospel of Luke, but Luke is here a doctor. Okay, that's from Colossians. And then it's after Christ's ascension, Paul had taken this doctor to be with him as a legal expert. So this is kind of weird. He's both a doctor and a lawyer. Yet neither did he see him in the flesh. This is the Muratorian fragment, okay? And again, I'm happy to talk more about this. There are some people who would say that this is based on a Greek text that was written in the late 2nd century, okay? And I don't hold that view because these sorts of developed traditions about Luke are actually only appear in the 4th century and beyond, okay? And actual lists of the books of the New Testament, like getting to the 27 books, is also a 4th century phenomenon. And this is essentially what the Muratorian fragment is. So I'm quite suspicious, but again, I recommend this book by Claire Rothschild on the Muratorian fragment. One other thing that will give you a sense for this Lucan legend is what's called the Anti-Marcionite prologue, which is maybe late 4th, but probably 5th century. And here again, we get a few more details about Luke, that he was actually of Syrian Antioch. He's a doctor, of course. He's a disciple of the apostles. Not really. I mean, that's kind of, fiction, right? He's only a companion of Paul. That's only one apostle. And later, he's a follower of Paul until his death, serving God without a wife. I don't know where that comes from. But it's nice for Luke to be celibate. I mean, that's what Paul recommended. He doesn't have children, and he dies. Look at how detailed this gets. This is amazing. He dies at 84 in Bithynia, which is interestingly not far from Marcion's homeland. But he writes the gospel in Greece. And as you continue on later in church tradition, this is how fiction works, right? It gets more, it doesn't get less and less detailed. It gets more and more detailed. Because this isn't based on memory. This is based on invention, right? So that, Luke, he actually becomes bishop of Thebes in Greece. And, he has his relics. By the way, his relics are still available today. You've got the skull of Luke somewhere in Europe, and you've got his body in Padua, I think. And you've got one single rib was sent to Thebes in Greece. So I mean, literally, like there are people today worshiping and bowing at the sarcophagus of Luke, and that's how the church works. And who am I to criticize this? But I think that if you're looking at this historically, let's face it, this is not early tradition. This is not early tradition at all. And I don't, folks, I mean, we can talk about this till we're blue in the face, but there is absolutely no reason for you to accept any of that church legend. I mean, if you can find a reason, let me know. I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful fiction, but that's not what we're after here, right? That's not what we're after. Now, there's tons and tons and tons and tons of things written on Luke, and tons of commentaries on Luke, and oh my goodness, you can start reading now, and seriously, you'll be 100 years old, and you won't be halfway through it. But if you're taking a historical approach, here's a couple of sources I can recommend. First of all, on the 10th Legion, Menahem Moore now has a standard monograph on the Bar Kokhba War. It's really good. I didn't have room to fit her, but there's a really good book on Aelia Capitolina. And if you watch my video on YouTube on Pagan Jerusalem, I mentioned her. But it's by this wonderful scholar named Shlomit Wexler Badola on Aelia Capitolina. Unfortunately, neither one of these books is affordable, but they are extremely scholarly, and they are the best of the best. A more accessible article which talks about Stratopodon and Stratopodon, that particular word is by David Wenkel, and it's called Military Camps Around Jerusalem and the Meaning of Stratopodon in Luke 21:20. That, I believe, is online. If you punch that into Google, I think you'll be able to find that. That's in the Journal of Greco-Roman Christianity and Judaism, and that is fairly recent.